Hello, welcome to my channel. Um, I wanted to record a quick video here on my lunch break, defending the moral argument. This has just been something on my mind, and I wanted to just get it out there, see if I could do a quick 15-minute video on it. All right. Now, it's been under attack recently by people like Joe Schmid, by other philosophers of religion. And I think it's a really powerful argument. It was actually the argument that moved me from agnosticism towards theism. And it goes something like this from William Lane Craig. If God does not exist, subjective moral values and duties do not exist. Objective moral values and duties do exist, therefore God exists. Now, I want to reframe that argument a little bit and argue like this. If physicalism is true, which is the view that everything that exists is just physical, is purely material. There's nothing beyond the material world. If physicalism is true, then objective moral values and duties do not exist. But they do exist, and therefore physicalism is false. In other words, the existence of objective moral values and duties gives us reason to think that physicalism is false. Here's my argument in a nutshell for moral realism, that there is objective moral values and duties. If we think about the nature of our affections and emotions that are built into the structure of our being, they seem to correspond to realities that would fittingly evoke them. So, for instance, that we feel fear corresponds to the fact that there's something in our environment that would fittingly evoke fear. That we feel hunger tips us off to the fact that in our environment there is something in the space in which we exist. There's something answerable to the experience of hunger, which would satisfy that experience. So the presence of emotions indicate realities that are answerable to those particular emotions. Now, it seems to me that moral affections are distinctive kinds of emotions. Outrage is a different kind of emotion or affection than just simple annoyance, than just stubbing your toe, for instance. The presence of annoyance in the human nature indicates something in the environment that would fittingly evoke that. Now, again, that's not to say that those things can't be unfittingly evoked. So there can be irrational fears, but those fears are irrational precisely because the thing that evokes them is not fittingly answerable to fear. It's irrational because the emotion does not fit the thing to which that emotion is responding, which seems to indicate that there are things for which that emotion would be reasonably evoked. Similarly, the presence of something like moral outrage indicates a reality in our environment to which that emotion would be fittingly evoked. So there is, as it were, then a kind of knowledge that's embedded even in the emotions that we feel. Emotions have a kind of epistemic value, that is to say that they yield real knowledge. Moral outrage can be fittingly or unfittingly evoked, which indicates that there's a reality to which it is answerable, a reality which ought to evoke it in our environment. And such things are true of other kinds of moral emotions: admiration, respect, recognition of dignity, these sorts of things. So the distinctiveness of moral emotions indicates a distinctive reality to which those emotions are answerable, just like hunger indicates a reality to which it is fittingly answerable, distinct from something like fear or distinct from something like joy, etc. Okay, so given moral realism, that there is a reality to which moral emotions are either fittingly or unfittingly evoked, can physicalism account for objective morality? Well, let's think about this. if you take a kind of God's eye perspective of the world, right? You're hovering over the world, our little blue planet, and everything that exists is just physical stuff. There's no sort of objective standard over and above by which to measure differing people's ideas of right and wrong. Right? There's no sort of standard in that physical environment that we can sort of perceive by which we can sort of adjudicate whose sense of right and wrong is more right or more wrong than another's. Now, there are a number of possible physicalist theories that I think don't work, that one could appeal to. So, for instance, someone could say, well, the good really is that which maximizes pleasure or happiness or utility in some sense, right? And we can define those in sort of physical terms. So Samuel Harris tries to do this in The Moral Landscape, for instance. I don't think that works because it leads to pretty appalling moral scenarios, right? So the sort of consequentialist rationale for shooting someone who's shooting up a theater is, well, if you don't shoot him, right, that's clearly doing damage to the shooter's body. If you don't, well, that's going to maximize the sort of damage to human flourishing as a whole. And so you shoot the shooter in order to maximize human flourishing, even if it's at the cost of an individual. Well, that leads to some pretty appalling places. For instance, if we found through AI, let's say measuring some ethnic group, that eliminating them would actually just because maybe for genetic factors, it would lead to less human flourishing long term. That human flourishing or physical flourishing, metrics of physical flourishing, would be maximized by eliminating this ethnic group, then it would be right to do so. Or eliminating the elderly, right? Because of the elderly, the strain they place on a financial system or whatever. So it leads to these sorts of problems that are pretty well known with consequentialism. Now, there's another metric, and it seems to me that this is something like what Joe Schmid believes, though I can't exactly pin him yet. That well, we can think about innate sorts of flourishing that don't require appeal to deity at all. So, for instance, we can tell that water causes a plant to flourish, and in a similar way, we can tell what does and doesn't allow people to flourish. But again, the problem with this is when we think about these sorts of scenarios where we have to do harm to someone for the general well-being, for the common good, like shooting up a theater. If the appeal there is, well, you shoot the shooter in order to maximize human flourishing, well, then we're back to consequentialism. It seems to me that these really are, as far as I can tell, the only possible physicalist theory, some version of consequentialism, really. Um, I'm open to hearing otherwise, but I like that doesn't it seems to not fit well. Furthermore, the affirmation that everyone has equal dignity cannot be satisfied if people are purely physical entities. Because if all that exists is physical stuff, dignity then has to identify some physical thing, some physical fact, because the only thing that exists is physical stuff. Now, if that's the case, because people are unequally constituted in all sorts of ways, it seems like you'd have differing assessments of the dignity of persons, that there would be no basis to affirm the equal dignity of persons. So moral realism then seems to lead us into a species of non-naturalism. Okay. Um, Now, how let's think about this idea of the moral law and our experience, and why this then points to theism. Okay, so there are moral non-naturalists, right? Eric Wielenberg is a good example of this, who is a moral non-naturalist. He thinks that objective morality does in a way, falsify physicalism. Now, one could sort of hold to a non-reductive physicalist view of morality. So, philosophy of mind, non-reductive physicalism says consciousness, although it is ontologically physical, is irreducible to physical description. I think that's actually quite incoherent, and I haven't seen a reason yet to think otherwise. That something can be in its constitution physical and yet not describable in the terms in which it actually exists. I would apply that to sort of non-reductive physicalist visions of the moral law. But what I want to suggest is that the experience of morality is best fitted to the notion that morality is a kind of communication. The experience of morality, at least, is a kind of experience of communication. The experience of the moral law really is the experience of an imperative, and the sort of imperative that really is only actionable by conscious agents. Right? I don't tell a rock to do stuff. Right? I give imperatives to agents, and especially moral imperatives to agents. Now, one might say, well, you can give an imperative to a dog, or a computer can give an imperative to you, or you can give an imperative to a computer, but those aren't really moral imperatives. Now, can a computer give a moral imperative? I'll address that in a second. But I can't give a moral imperative to a computer in the sense that if the computer fails to execute the imperative, that I can hold it morally responsible. But I can hold things responsible that have the faculty of the will, which is a property of consciousness. So imperatives, at least of the moral sort, are forms of communication that are relevant only for conscious agents. And I want to argue that imperatives relevant for conscious agents only emanate from a consciousness. So even if a computer, right, gives me a moral imperative, I see the instructions flash on a screen, do this or else, right? The imperative is ultimately sourced in a conscious agent. That is to say that the structure of a program or the structure of a computer which issues a imperative, and it's such an imperative, ultimately finds its originating source in a consciousness that gave it and designed it as such to give moral imperatives. So in that way, moral imperatives like language are really only relevant for conscious agents from conscious agents through whatever means that they're delivered. And as such, the experience of the moral law seems to be relevantly analogous to the experience of imperatives of language, wherein those imperatives are only relevant for conscious agents from conscious agents. Okay. And I also want to claim that morality seems to be an indicator of happiness defined broadly. That which is truly meaningful or important in some sense. Now, ought claims, why do we think this? Well, we tend to think that moral imperatives are universally binding, that they have a kind of universal force. Even if they're situation specific, they have a kind of universal force. They're sort of emanating from universal moral principles or universal virtues, things like this. Ought claims in general are grounded in teleology. So, for instance, if I have a goal of baking a cake, then I ought to get eggs. I ought to get milk, right? Oughts emerge in the context of goals. So, if morality specifies universal oughts, it must be rooted or an indicator of a goal that sort of pertains to humanity at large. And of course, this is why the classical tradition, Aristotle, Plato, all the way through to Aquinas, and throughout history, have seen the good life as the happy life. Happiness in the human soul, in its most deepest, truest sense, is actualized by living a good life. Now, that really only works if it's correlated, if the good, the moral good, is correlated to the structure of our nature in such a way where our enacting the good is the enactment of is the actualization or attainment of a goal that's universal to humanity. And the one goal I can think of that's universal to humans is happiness. Everyone seeks their happiness, their ultimate fulfillment, their ultimate joy. Everyone seeks this. And it seems to be without exception that everyone seeks this. Uh, and so the claim of theism is that the good life, the morally good life, is the objective way to get there. Now, physicalism is true. It really seems like there isn't any sort of universal structure such that you have a wide set of moral oughts or of the sort that we sort of value. So you might get oughts like, well, you ought to feed yourself, right? You ought to sustain your life. So maybe there's a base level there. But in terms of moral goods and the sorts of moral goods we value as a society, physicalism and physicalist accounts of flourishing and consequentialism don't seem to get you there. So, for instance, suppose you have two people, Bob and Jack, who give their time to serving the poor. They give their time generously. And yet, Bob does it just because he loves the praise of people that he gets from it. Jack does it because he actually loves the poor. Both of them are getting lots of joy. Both of them are actually objectively contributing to the common good to the same extent. And yet we would say Jack is the more virtuous person. He's living the good life. Bob is not. If we want to uphold that intuition, it seems to me like we have to reject physicalism. That intuition doesn't seem to be secured by physicalism. There's no reason to sort of give for that intuition, for the truthfulness of that intuition on physicalist accounts of morality. There is on theism. And finally, I want to suggest that love as the highest virtue, as the unification of the good, is a better fit with Christianity in particular than it is with physicalist evolution. So, physicalist evolution seems to then imply a sort of evolutionary psychology where the different contours of our being are such because they enable us to survive. And this makes sense on some level. Hunger, for instance. Why do we get hungry? Well, because it secures our survival. Why do we get thirsty? Well, because it secures our survival. Why do we form societies even? Well, it's easier to procure certain natural goods in societies. Now, this is where I think it starts to break down. An evolutionary psychological account of friendship would say that friendship is really good, or rather, at least we're wired towards friendship because it helps us secure certain goods pertinent to our survival. Maybe in making a friend, you are more able to build a house in society. You're more able to have a network to fall back on if certain physical goods don't go your way, things like this. But here's the problem with that. We don't think or experience friendship that way, right? That doesn't really seem to be the best construal of friendship. So it seems that if we say friendship, people make friends to. If I made a friend to like because they cooked me a good dinner, like that friend would probably feel exploited, right? Like I only befriend Bob because Bob's cooking is really good. That friend would feel like that's a bastardization of friendship. So it seems like we approach relationships in such a way where the relationship in it and of itself is valued for its own sake. So it seems like we at least experience relationships such that we should seek them as an end in themselves and not for the sake of some other good. Love, it seems, is that which makes life worth living. right? You can be starving and on the brink of even death, and yet sense your life is good if you have someone to share it with. I think that's a huge clue to the way human nature is structured that doesn't really fit with evolutionary psychology, which would suggest that we really only make friends to secure these other goods pertinent to our survival. But it is a good fit with Christianity, which says that we are made in the image of one that is love in himself. And Christianity then provides a rationale for why love is the unification of all of the virtues. Because all virtues, the good, are refractions of the good at the foundation of all reality, and because, per Christianity, the good is triune love, all virtues are elements and refractions of love. So that's my sort of brief sketch of the moral argument. I want to develop that more at some point, but go ahead and let me know what you think in the comments below. Thanks so much for watching. God bless.